Alright, this is it, the third and final part of the 351 Windsor swap into my 73 Mustang, where in this video we do wrap up this build, for now, by finally getting this 351 into the Stang and bringing it back to its glory. If you haven't already seen the first two parts, I do highly recommend watching those. In the first part we went through and basically removed the entire drivetrain to get ready for the swap, and then in the second part we did a full teardown and freshen up of the 351 Windsor, and some needed upgrades to get ready to drop into the Mustang in this video. But now that we are here, it's time we finally get this thing in and get it running. So first up is actually going to be using the motor mounts off the 302 that we pulled out, because again, perk of the 351 Windsor, not only do these mounts bolt up exactly the same to the 351, this section of the block is dimensionally identical between the 302 and the 351 Windsor. Meaning if you pull the 302 out of something and use the same motor mounts, a 351 will drop right in. But with that being done, we're pretty much ready to throw this thing in, and that's exactly what I did next. And I will say, for as many frustrating moments as I encountered during this build, this had to have been one of the easiest parts of the entire thing, surprisingly. I mean, this motor dropped in with no question, with both bolt holes on either side lining up first try. The whole video clip of pushing the engine hoist forward all the way to tightening down the bolts on the motor mounts is literally 17 minutes, so I have no room to complain here. To finish mounting the motor, we're going to go ahead and get the transmission back in place to help the motor sit in its natural orientation. But before we do that, we are going to go ahead and take our brand new pilot bearing and throw this thing in the freezer. That will help it shrink for a couple of hours, so that it's a lot easier to hammer into the crank when we get there. Since I may or may not have forgotten the rear main seal earlier, we're going to go ahead and do that now, and since this is a later model motor, we do have the luxury of a one-piece rear main seal. So I don't need to worry about pulling the pan or anything, we can simply hammer this thing around to seat it properly. As with most engines with automatics bolted behind them, they don't use a pilot bearing, and so the bore and the crank, since this motor did have an automatic bolted behind it, is typically pretty gross with some pretty heavy surface rust going on. So what I did was I took some WD-40 and some Scotch-Brite, and I did my best to clean up the surface ahead of time so that we had an easier time sticking the pilot bearing in. But after doing that and putting just a light film of oil on the pilot and the bore, we went ahead and took a 1-inch socket and tapped this thing in. After making sure the pilot was fully seated, we can now roll around to getting the full clutch setup back in place here. First up is not going to be the flywheel, but instead the separator plate. If you do forget this plate after putting the entire clutch setup back on, which I have seen online, you're going to be pulling everything back off. But after putting the plate on, I'm going to line up the flywheel on the back, which does only line up one way with the 6 bolts to ensure the counterbalance lines up properly, and then get that bolted down. I am using red Loctite on all of these bolts and then torquing down the flywheel to spec. As you can see here, I'm using a long bar and some studs to keep the motor from spinning over while using the torque wrench. But wrapping up the clutch side of things, I'm going to pull out my input shaft lineup tool centered in the clutch and pressure plate sandwiched together and throw this thing on the flywheel. The whole process of putting the flywheel and clutch is a tad difficult when you're doing this by yourself, especially on concrete outside on the ground, but this is a doable job once you're able to get some of the bolts started. But after the pressure plate is torqued down to spec, I'm going to go ahead and use my jack to put this T5 back on. I have the throw-up bearing and the input shaft with the fork and a thin layer of grease on all of these lined up, and we're just going to slowly work this whole thing on. After putting in all the bolts around the bell housing and ignoring how honestly gross this transmission looks, I can go ahead and jack up the tail housing on the transmission to lift it up as a unit to line up with the T5 specific transmission crossmember. At this point, the drivetrain is basically sitting in its permanent spot and bolted down properly. So now we can go ahead and start with some of the smaller things like the speedometer cable, and then we can throw in the drive shaft. But honestly, this is where the fun really begins, and we can start adapting everything else to work properly with the 351 that was originally designed for a 302. So for now, we are going to move up to the engine bay and start piecing everything together. Since we don't currently have any headers in the way, this makes getting in the starter about 10 times easier, so that's exactly what I went ahead and did. Even though I'm pretty meticulous in how I keep my tools and parts organized, the nut that goes on the stud of the starter somehow managed to run away from me, which unfortunately did require a trip to Ace Hardware because the threads on that stud are actually pretty unique. I didn't hook up the starter wider just yet because normally it routes through the header pipe, so we left that off for right now. I figured now was a good time to throw on our beautiful 650 double pumper on top, of course with no choke, to make this really look like a completed motor. I will say, slight spoiler alert, but this carburetor ended up being the reason why I chose to keep the stock cam in this motor and not go with an aftermarket cam while we had this apart, and later wiping out all the lobes. This was a used carburetor off marketplace that I knew nothing about and therefore preemptively did not trust it. Also, putting in a cam after we already have everything together really isn't all that hard of a job, so I figured this route made more sense in the long run. But moving on to getting the top end actually sorted, I went ahead and hooked up the steel fuel line off the fuel pump to a filter and then through a rubber hose to the carb fuel inlet. I figured the water pump needed some attention afterwards, so I went ahead and hooked up the heater core drain hose from the firewall to the water pump, and then went to install the coolant bypass elbow just to realize that it had actually torn. So after cutting some similar size hose, I was able to make it work, and after plugging in the heater core inlet up top, went ahead and reused the same primary radiator hoses from the top and bottom of the radiator off the 302 on the 351. They lined up just fine. While the fan and fan shroud were out, I also went ahead and replaced the old battery tray because the original one was honestly held on by hopes and dreams. So I went ahead and ordered one from CJ Pony Parts and made that corner of the engine bay look just a tad nicer. One of my favorite parts of this build was being able to keep the serpentine setup, mostly just because I think it looks pretty cool, but it did take quite a bit of research to find the right belt length because the original setup would have also had an AC pump and a smog pump, which I obviously don't have. So I found a forum online where this guy found that a belt from a 2014 Hyundai Sonata of all things would work. He mentioned specifically that only an 83.75 inch belt will work and that an 83.5 inch and 84 inch won't work. I figured there was no way that a 1/4 inch would make that much of a difference. I mean, isn't that the whole point of the tensioner, or at least half the point of a tensioner? So I went to AutoZone. The only thing available was an 83.5 inch, and it turns out that worked perfectly fine. I guess the tensioner does do exactly what I thought it would do, and that 1/4 inch made no difference. This may vary by vehicle if you're doing a swap like this yourself, but for me, this worked totally fine. In the previous video, we talked a bit about the alternator situation, but a quick recap, I bought a new 70 amp 1G alternator to keep my electrical system the same as what it previously was. These 1G alternators always come with a V-belt pulley, but we were able to take the serpentine pulley off of the 2G alternator that came originally on the 351 Windsor, and it bolted the same onto the new 1G alternator. With that, we could hook up all of our alternator connections the same, so there's no hassle there, and we were still able to use the serpentine system. While we are here, we still needed a dipstick since we converted to a front sump pan and mechanical timing cover, so we needed to have a dipstick off the front of the timing cover. I tried a couple different solutions, but ended up coming out from underneath the alternator, which was still very accessible, and you were able to check the oil just fine. Since recording this, a fun quirk that I have found is since the dipstick is metal, if you pull it out in a certain way, you will hit the starter solenoid and shoot some fun sparks everywhere. So I probably should have gone with my nifty initial idea of routing it closer to the water pump, but at this point it's pretty much buried in there, so we're just going to call it a feature. In going through all the accessories, I moved on to the power steering pump since I had been procrastinating it, knowing that Ford, in their almighty wisdom, designed it so that instead of keeping with the original male inlet on my old pump on the high pressure side, thought it would be funny to keep everything the same, but just make it a female inlet instead. So now I have 2 female ends that I have to deal with. The drain was fortunately the same. It's hard for them to screw that part up, but as for the high pressure side, there are many ways of going about this, but what I ended up doing was taking the old pump I had and cutting off the male fitting that was on that pump and simply threading it into the female port on the new pump. Ford decided to keep the threads identical in this case, so I guess I can thank them there. So now I was able to simply thread on the high pressure line, and yeah, it does not reach. I tried every which way, there was really no way for this line to reach. So instead, I took the entire line off the system and took it over to my hydraulic press. Using a combination of heat, a torch, and patience, I was able to bend this line just enough to where I could comfortably get this line on the pump. Since we were in the area, I went ahead and figured out the throttle cable situation. Though the mounting position on this new manifold was a bit different than my previous manifold, it was pretty close with some modification, so I went with the old measure once, cut twice method, and I was able to get this cable sitting pretty nice with the carb here. I went ahead and made sure with a friend that when you press on the pedal that nothing overextends and that everything's good to go, and then after that I moved on to the return spring. I made sure just to have a little bit of tension on the return spring at the idle position on the throttle blades. Moving somewhat away from the engine bay and to the interior, I wanted to go ahead and install my gauges, including water temp, mechanical oil pressure, and voltage. Water temp probably being the easiest, I went ahead and routed it through the firewall and into the intake manifold. Oil pressure was next, and if you remember from episode 2, we preemptively installed one of the fittings into the side of the timing cover earlier, which, as you can see right now, is super easy to access. Jokes aside, if I had realized it would be this crammed in here, I would have fitted the entire line on here before we even put the motor in. But once I was tightened down and hooked up to the gauge, I decided to wire in all the lights for the other gauges, including the tach. Diving into wiring real quick here, I hadn't actually realized this, but on my Mustang's fuse box it had a dedicated accessory stud to work off. I looked at the wiring diagram for the car and I didn't really get a clear answer as to how this stud was fused, so I went ahead and put an inline 7.5 amp fuse on this from the accessory stud to another stud that I added underneath the dash. With this, we now had a reliable source of key-on power to power 3 gauge lights, the voltmeter, tach power, and the tach light, all of which were just grounded to the dash. The tach also has a 4th wire, but that is for the distributor and will go out to the engine bay for the distributor signal. As for the distributor itself, we will get into this a little bit later, but since we are running an HEI GM style unit, we cannot use the original resistance wire that powered the original coil. Instead, I found a fuse on the fuse box that was on with both key on and key run, and put a brand new 12 gauge wire out to the engine bay for this, which was also fused. With the plan for wiring in mind, we can drop in a brand new battery and get all of our wires made up and see if it all works. To which immediately we pop the accessory stud fuse. So I slowly followed the diagram from the stud down and found out that the voltage gauge kept popping the fuse. Pretty hard to screw up wiring for a voltage gauge, it only does one thing. So I tested the gauge on my voltmeter and found out that this brand new gauge was actually dead. It had an internal short. Can't complain too much, the whole 3 gauge unit was like 30 bucks. My buddy had some gauges from his boat that he didn't need, so I went in and wired another volt gauge, and this one did not pop the fuse, but it would also not read any voltage, so not super helpful there. This battery is brand new, so I knew that that was not the issue, so I went and ordered a brand new voltage gauge from a more reputable brand and put in that singular gauge, and what do you know, that one worked just fine. 3rd time's a charm, right? Switching gears back over to the engine bay, it was unfortunately time for headers. I went ahead and put the clutch cable on with its cover, making sure it was in place in the same spot that we measured before when we removed it with the 302. But onto seeing if these headers fit. The passenger side of course had no issues sliding right in, but the driver's side was a bit of a different story. I'll save you some time and just say that it was really close, but no matter what I did, it was just not going to work. Looking back on it now, I think if I had lifted up the motor slightly, then I believe it might have actually worked, but essentially having to pull the motor to change spark plugs didn't sound all that appealing to me. Fortunately, Hedman Headers sells, quote, 351 Windsor swap headers, which sounds super vague, and they said it actually would not fit my body style of Mustang. There's a couple of people in the reviews who said that it might, but they weren't too sure, so I'm not really sure why they left reviews, but they did. They visually did look correct, and so I ended up buying them, and you know what, they fit just fine on the driver's side, which was pretty relieving. I didn't have to move the motor or anything, but I did have to pull spark plugs, but that's kind of given the territory. The only thing, and this is a pretty big one, is that to be able to clear this, you can see that header pipe 7 goes up and over 8 to make this work. And holy cow, does this make installing the header bolts in that area an absolute nightmare. And I think absolute nightmare is an understatement. The passenger side is probably a 15-20 minute job. The driver's side easily takes 2 to 3 hours, and that's not even an exaggeration. Once it's in, you probably hate yourself, but, you know, just be glad it's done. Getting our way closer to starting this motor, I wanted to go ahead and get this thing its first initial pre-oil. I filled up the power steering pump, fearing I would forget to fill it later and blow it up, but then went ahead and filled up the motor too. I just used 1030 here, specifically a synthetic blend. I'm no expert on oil. I was reading up that a blend is actually better for new bearings when breaking them in, so I just decided to run that. I will go ahead and pre-oil the engine once again. This is the first time around. We will do it another time about 30 minutes before we actually start the motor. But I first wanted to confirm that I could actually see oil coming out of every single rocker. This was confirmed after a few minutes of oiling and turning the crank a few times, to which this also gave me an opportunity to check the oil pressure, which was pretty great at 60 psi, so really happy to see that. But I could also check to see if there was any leaks, to which there was. I only saw one leak. It was actually coming from the oil pressure line fitting, so I simply went to tighten it up and it literally snapped in half. Half of it was in the timing cover and the other half just came out. I probably should have seen that coming, given that this kit was part of that gauge kit, which was like $30, but I can't lie, that one hurt quite a bit. I literally sat there under my car for probably a full 10 minutes to avoid having a mental breakdown, but once I regained my composure, I went ahead and ripped off all the power steering lines, bracket bolts, and anything else in the way, and used an extractor bit to get the rest of this piece out. I ran the drill one more time in the oil pump to pump out any shavings that might have come off in this process. I then bought a nice copper line kit, which I probably should have done to begin with new fittings, and I used Permatex sealant on all of the threads and put everything back to how it should be. I then checked once more to confirm that we still made good oil pressure, and indeed we did, and then I left everything alone because I didn't want to touch it and break it again. Fortunately, we now are on the home stretch. There's really not too many other things that we need to worry about at this point in time. The fan and fan shroud are up next, to which, if you remember, since we're going with a serpentine setup, we actually need a reverse rotation fan, which is exactly what I bought. I actually got a larger one because I had more room for it. Of course, Ford, being Ford, did not like the water pump bolt spacing on the 302, and they decided they needed to be larger for the 351, so I needed to buy a completely different spacer for this fan. But other than that, it was actually pretty straightforward to install everything with the fan and the shroud. Given that you want your fan to be about halfway in and halfway out of the fan shroud, I ended up having to space my fan shroud a little bit closer to the engine off the radiator to make up this difference. But at this point, we're about ready to drop in this distributor and start it up, right? Wrong. There will always be more issues, and the issues do not stop. I'm warning you. Because I filled this thing up with coolant and then immediately got a very steady stream of coolant coming right from the water pump area. This actually took quite a while to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was coming out of one of the seams of the water pump itself. Not the weep hole, but I knew this had something to do with the timing cover situation that I talked about in the previous video. So tragically, at this point, everything on the front, including the water pump, now needed to come back off. So after taking off the water pump, you can actually see where the water was leaking out of. You can see that that gasket does not fully cover up this area, but more importantly, that means the backing plate on the water pump was also not covering the spot. We could throw a reverse gasket in here, but that could not be a reliable fix that I can trust, as hot water is flowing through this and could eventually eat away through that gasket at that point and tear it. So after taking a long look at both of the pumps, even though the pumps themselves actually look very different, the backing plates and bolting of all but 2 bolts were actually the same on both pumps. Now, I'm not sure if it's because my 302 pump was cast iron and heavier that they assumed they needed 2 more bolts on top to hold this pump, but I figured out that if you take off the backing plate of the cast iron pump and place it onto the 351 Windsor aluminum pump, this would actually solve the issue. You simply need to drill out the top bolt hole of the cast iron pump backing plate that was never used. And what is fascinating by this is that you can actually see circled in red here that even though this pump is 20 years older than the 351 pump, there's a faint provision for where this bolt hole would actually go normally. I don't know why that's there, but maybe I'm missing something, but it works if you drill that out. The only other potential for concern I could see now is the 2 unused bolt holes on the timing cover itself. So I went ahead and cleaned these very well and put a thick bead of RTV in both of those holes. They go through, so you can put RTV on both sides, and this is really just as a secondary precaution. I couldn't actually see whether or not this would actually cause any issues, but you might as well. It doesn't really cause any issues. I could have missed something online, but I looked for a really long time on this topic. I looked through a lot of forums, and I really struggled to find any other option other than just purchasing an expensive aftermarket timing cover that had both the mechanical fuel pump provision as well as also worked for a counterclockwise pump. Okay, this time I'm not kidding. We're actually at the point where we're ready to go with actually starting this thing, at least on paper. After pre-oiling the motor one more time, I backed out all of the idle adjustments on the carb, about 2 turns, and then I set the idle screw on the blade to what I thought would be a pretty good spot for starting. I also set the timing to around 14 degrees and plugged in the timing advance, PCV, and brake booster into the carb. I went ahead and dropped in our super fancy Chinese HEI distributor, hooked up the spark plug wires, as well as the connections for powering the HEI itself. Now, I will say I'm using a carb that I've never used before and a distributor that I've never used before, and I tried start after start after start, flipping the distributor 180 multiple times, starting fluid, adjusting timing, and nothing was working. I could not get this thing to start. I don't know why. I don't really know what I was doing, but after one of the attempts, well, I'll just let you take a listen. Hell, I don't know about y'all, but I think this thing sounds pretty damn good. Maybe I'm just riding this high that all this effort seems to have paid off, but holy cow, does it feel good to finally hear this thing running for the first time. I went ahead and looked around for any leaks, and we were absolutely chilling. No coolant anywhere. Oil pressure was looking fantastic. Since getting around to finishing up this video, I've put about 500 miles on this thing, and there have been some minor issues, mostly with the carb, but the motor itself has been great. I drove it down to Seattle, which is about 2 hours away from me, and really it had no issues, other than maybe the headlights going out, but that is unrelated to the motor. I can confidently say that this thing puts down the power a hell of a lot better than the 302 did, and it is really fun to slam gears through. Speaking of slamming gears, I don't know how long this T5 is going to last, especially with me driving, Fortunately, these are pretty easy to find. We're already over the torque limit of this thing, but it is still a ton of fun, and I don't mind going through them. Now, before I go, if you have decided to stick around this long, my next build is something that I have wanted to do for a very long time, and I've already been putting some pretty serious hours into it. There is a 5.9 liter turbo diesel with 12 valves sitting next to me, and it is not a Cummins, to say the least. But I will say, thank you so much for watching. I've already been quite surprised by the amount of views I've gotten on my other videos, and so I'm pretty motivated to keep making these. So I really appreciate everyone who watches these, and I hope to share my next project with you as soon as I can.